So in today's talk, I'm going to approach the topic from a different point of view, which on the surface might seem like a contradiction to what I normally say. And if you've been listening for long enough and actually being able to hear the shifting perspectives, it'll be one of the not so common approaches that I take, but you'll see how it is a filling in of the differing views that I often speak about. So to put that into context, often I will say, look, we are not formless awareness, and life is not an illusion, that we have to live life as if it is real after liberation, meaning liberation, realization, doesn't bring about the end of life, doesn't bring about the end of time or the end of causality. Those components still continue to exist after life is seen clearly. And so often I'm speaking about how that perspective is often taken by a seeker and run with a little bit hard, we could say, where the other perspective of life is seen to be unreal, let's say, and therefore not integrated into the way someone appreciates life. And yet, having said what I've just said, that often I'm sort of saying, hey, let's not get carried away with that. Let's also acknowledge another aspect of life, like the form and the causality and the person. You'll hopefully appreciate that I have a great respect for the top-down teachings that say you are formless awareness and you are not the person, and that life is an illusion, that time doesn't exist, that thinking is the problem. Whereas often I will say, look, thinking per se is not the problem. We have the working mind, and if the working mind were to stop functioning, if all thinking were to stop functioning, we wouldn't be able to perform in life. We wouldn't be able to move. We wouldn't be able to think about what decision to make next. And yet, I have great respect for the teachings that say thinking is the problem, because, as you've heard me say, the teachings, whichever angle they come at it from, are not actually the truth. No teaching is expressing the truth. A teaching expresses concepts that are pointing at, we could say in quotes, the truth, which is really meaning let's drop out of relating to what is through concepts, because the concepts will always diminish or reduce what is down. And as soon as that happens, as soon as we reduce what is down, then we don't know what is. We have slipped into a conceptual interpretation of what is, thinking that that is the thing itself. And in so doing, lost touch, lost contact with life itself, and now have an idea of life. So the teachings are always putting forward a concept, even when a teaching says this isn't a teaching. That's a concept. When it says that it's not a teaching because there is no seeker, It's not a teaching because there's nothing to be found. See, each of those, there is no seeker, that's a concept. There's nothing to be found, that's a concept. And yet, they are concepts that are not the sort of concept that our thinking is used to receiving. So it gets to sneak in as a concept, because it is a concept. All teachings are putting forward concepts. And yet, they seem like they're teachings that are not putting forward concepts, because they are not concepts that we're used to, and they are concepts that give us less to do and less to think about. They are undermining the doership and the seeking, because the normal standpoint is, I am the seeker and I need to make seeking happen. Please tell me what to do. Give me a teaching. And so if the teacher says, here's the teaching, standard makeup will say, oh, thank you for giving me what I need in order to get more knowledge, which I will use to get the understanding and to get where I need to go. And that's the doership and attachment to outcome relating to the teaching in a particular way. So some teachings say, I have to sort this out. How do I sort it out? So they sort it out by saying, this is not a teaching. There's no one to teach. And so then we say, well, why is that teacher standing there talking? And it's just what's happening. It's not teaching, it's just talking happening. The reality is that it is a teaching, it is putting forward concepts, and the wisdom of the teaching is putting forward the concepts in a way where the concept says it's not a teaching and it's not talking to a seeker. So in my introduction here today, you might be completely confused, because on the one hand, I seem to be saying one thing and then a contradiction, saying this is valid and that is valid, and our thinking doesn't like that. It's like, okay, tell me which one is it? It's all of it. And what you might start to appreciate is that the teachings really are, in their own way, attacking the thinking that is so habituated in the system. Thinking that is thinking of a specific type. Thinking that is of doership and let me do something, that's the purpose of life, for me to get somewhere. And if the purpose of life is me getting somewhere, then I have to be the one that gets there, the one that does the getting there. And the seeker generally has this idea that happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so the teachings, in their own unique ways, are addressing that. So they will put forward concepts in the teaching that undermine a certain type of thinking. Like, there is no seeker. So that is the truth. As the teaching might not say it that way, or it might say it that way, but essentially what it's delivering is information to the one listening that says, listen, the truth is there is no seeker, so don't be the seeker. There is an illusion, or when we take life the wrong way, then a seeker comes into existence, and that is misunderstanding that they're really in life as it really is, there's nothing to seek. We're already enlightened. And the unenlightenment is to not realize that we're already enlightened and to be seeking. So that teaching, when it says something like that, is cutting off a movement of suffering. And because it's not the absolute truth, because it's just dealing with one of the movements of suffering, it's there's a paradox, because our seeking, when it happens, actually does give us answers. So seeking is a problem, and it's also a part of the solution. So once again, it's like, oh, so which is it? Is it the problem or is it part of the solution? It's both. It's all of it. And the process sorts all of this out. The process refines us. It refines the seeking movement down in a way that as the seeking starts gathering more of the required information, including information that there is no seeker, meaning there is no doer, you could put it that way, that is going to manage to get where they want to go. That liberation is about stopping and being. Liberation is not about struggling and doing and getting. And yet that stopping only happens after enough seeking has brought in enough information for attention to land on that seeking and striving and attached attitude, to notice that is suffering. If that got cut off prematurely, then a lot of the required information to cut it off, that's why it wouldn't get cut off prematurely. A lot of the required information to cut it off, and also to cut off other movements of suffering, which in practical terms are guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, all based on the belief, the deeply ingrained belief that I am a separate, independent doer in control of everything I think, feel, say, and do. And that as this separate human being that is the doer, my happiness is to be found in pleasure and pain. And so those different forms of suffering and all of the subtle variations under each of those headings go unnoticed, and slowly the spotlight starts landing on the different ones. And so today I was talking with someone, and he was talking about how very much certain movements are seen to be forms of suffering, and there is a non-involvement in them, or there is a falling away of them. So, for example, seeing that something unfolded a certain way, and the witnessing it or the relating to it in a way that is without necessarily there being a thought. It couldn't be any other way. This is just life unfolding, destiny unfolding, the inevitability of life unfolding that way. And sometimes it's going to be painful. Sometimes the other is going to be aggressive towards us while we're driving the car, for example. They're up against our bumper, trying to get us to get out of the wrong lane because they're in a rush. And that can scare us, it can frustrate us, it can make us angry. And an attitude can come in that understands that this is just life moving, the circumstances as it is, and then the feelings that come up as it is, and there's a peace with that. And so that's a great sign. So, he has less suffering by default than would have been the case at a previous point in time. And then what led us into an exploration was but it just seems like it happens so slowly. The understanding goes in, and sure enough, it's happening, but it just seems to happen so slowly. Can't it happen a little faster? How can we get it to happen a little faster? And so I think that was described as one of the forms. So another good sign was the recognition, oh, there still is a way to go. So that was the feedback, oh, less suffering, but there still is a way to go. So how can we make it go a bit faster? And so, my response is, can we see that very thinking, how can we make it move a bit faster, is in itself an extra layer of suffering. It's a thought about the seeking process, about the amount of suffering or lack of suffering in someone's life. And that narrative, that thinking about it, is maybe in a very subtle way saying, but it should be different, it should be better, it should be moving quicker. Now, I'm not saying, well, it hasn't, I'm not saying it hasn't moved slowly, for example, because it might be that it's taken 3 years for one little thing to be seen. So objectively, if we were just discerning, we could go, well, it has taken a while. When the thought comes in and says, I'd like it to go quicker, that layer of thinking may actually just be suffering that can fall away. So do you see that thinking is a form of suffering? And the funny thing with suffering is, until we realize, until we see it, until we go, oh, that's a form of expectation, that's a form of attachment to outcome, until it's seen, it might habitually come in and not be recognized as suffering. And so when it comes in, it does make the present moment less peaceful. And that can happen without us even really realizing that this sneaky bit of suffering has come in the back door. So understanding the different forms and seeing them in our own experience, in our own life, how they present very uniquely, because we can talk about the generic types of suffering, and then when we see, oh, this is a thought that happens often, and that's suffering, and once it's seen in its obtuse, in its obvious form, then there's able to be a dropping out of that thinking to where we just stop. It's like, that thinking is there, and in the thinking there is a presupposition of somewhere to go and how life should be, and in that thinking there is a seeker or someone who is not quite satisfied with the pace of things. And it's like, stop. And the stop isn't a stop to someone that I'm saying, okay, with your effort, just stop. And you want to be moving forward, just stop. It's a rolling back. It's a dissolving into nothingness. The thinking about, I wonder why it's going so slow. What can I do to make it go faster? Stop. Which really means stop that thinking, which is not really an instruction to a doer to stop doing it. It's an input in the present moment that may have the effect of cutting off, not because there's a doer there, but just like if you get a brick and you hit a glass window, the simple, or not even you, if there's a brick and it falls off a ledge because it was just teetering on the edge, and it lands on someone's glasses or on a glass, drinking glass, it will break it. Not because there was a doer there, it's just one force coming in contact, or one object coming in contact with another object, and there is a result, there's a consequence. And so in seeking, it can be stop. The stop is an object, a thought object or a sound object that is received by the the person, or it can be an internal stop that arises as a thought, and it's registered by the intellect, by the working mind, and it's understood that stop means come into the present where you are, outside of this attitude of how things should be and how they should be different. So in that moment, there isn't a doer that is by force having to hold closed a door that wants to pop open. It's actually about the force that's pushing the door open dissolving. So stopping is so effortless. You can put your little finger on the door and it won't open, because in that moment the force that was pushing the door has dissolved. Whereas if the doer is there, there's a force on the other side of the door pushing the door open, and then the doer has to keep the door closed. And the funny thing is, the force on the other side of the door is the doer. And so the solution is where the stop, the thought from a wise place in us that understands what suffering is, comes up, says stop, means dissolve into being. And these movements, just moving fast in life because you need to get all these things done, without us realizing, as we're moving fast, worried or stressed because we're not going to get everything done in the day, that movement is by default a form, included in it is a form of suffering. Like, I must get all this done in order to be complete, in order for life to be okay. I have to get from here to there in this time so I can do this and that. And without us knowing, that movement includes in it a narrative that is a form of suffering. And it's like, stop. If we see ourselves rushing, we might just say, stop rushing. And someone goes, oh, but you might not get to the grocery store in time. Go, well, that would be God's will then. If that happens, then that's life unfolding. And because I know that that's life unfolding as destined, then I can have an attitude towards that when it happens. I go, I guess it's destined for me not to have dinner tonight. I'll have to eat a mixture of stuff from the pantry. And we say, is that okay? And with a certain attitude, we go, well, it must be destined for tonight, the amount of pleasure or pain not to be as pleasurable as if I was getting fresh produce, maybe. And we go, is that okay? Well, that's the flow of life. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. If we can't accept that the flow of life, when we're in harmony, so if we're really busy rushing to get all these things done, which are sort of, in theory, more pleasure for us, if we're attached to pleasure, then slowing down doesn't make sense. Because we'll say, if I slow down, I'm not going to get this outcome. And if our attitude to the outcome is one of, I need that, it needs to be the way my conceptualization about it is, then there's this feedback loop that keeps us attached to outcomes, keeps us rushing. And if it's seen, when we see it for ourselves, and we go, oh, I didn't realize that this type of moving is very linked to attachment to outcome, to not seeing that life is going to turn out one way, and however it turns out is okay, because at worst it's just pain instead of pleasure. And in fact, if I slow everything down, I might find that the pains that I expected may not eventuate. Maybe everything gets rejigged, and my lifestyle then changes over time. Certain things dropping away because there isn't time for them. If I'm taking it at a pace which is life is unfolding pace, the pace where it's like I'm making life happen is usually much quicker than the life is unfolding pace, because there's a different attitude driving. So it's slow down. So the stop can be when you realize the franticness. Just stop and see what things can fall away because we have a concept about they need to be there. We say, well, what if we rejig our idea and say, I'm going to prioritize slowing down, so something's going to have to fall away. Anyway, the only reason I mention that is because it can be a form of suffering that we haven't recognized. So why is it that I said that today's talk is going to be a little different? So going back to the talk I was having today, I suggested that the attachment to outcomes can sometimes dissolve very slowly when life is continued to be known primarily as a world of form, a world of time and space, a world of a human being living in amongst form. And the reason for that is that some very subtle and automatic relationships to outcomes can remain in place simply because life hasn't presented itself in a way where the seeker gets their idea about what life is truly shaken. So if life continues to present as largely a world of form, a world of wood and stone and iron and plastic, and here and there, yesterday and tomorrow, then some relationships to pleasure and pain, or some bonds towards that make up the attachment to pleasure and pain, simply don't get dislodged at all quickly. What tends to dislodge some of the deep bonds that keep attachment to outcome in place is the shift in perspective. And a shift in perspective really means what we could call a shift in identity, a shift in knowing who or what we are, such that qualitatively, we could say experientially, qualitatively, all of life radically presents itself as something completely different to what we've always known life as. So in an instant, the world of form transforms. The world of time and space, the world of being a human, is turned upside down, dissolves, and is replaced by a completely different sense, a completely different appreciation, not appreciation from the perspective of the human, but appreciation from a sense of self that is completely foreign to us. And in that moment, it's like, oh my. And I'm putting words to it. It's a silent oh my contained in the seeing of life differently. It's like, life is nothing at all like what I thought it was. Life is nothing like what I experienced it as. And that shift in the quality of life, not as in the qualitative nature of the life experience, that shift has the power and capacity to break so many of the bonds that keep us relating to outcomes, keep us relating as if we're the doer, keep us relating to life as it's a world of form. Now, why is this, I keep saying, a world of form? So let's talk about the framework using less polished concepts than are normally put forward, because the thing with the polished concepts is we can sometimes, especially when we hear them over and over and over, hear them conceptually, understand them, but really miss, in a way, what it's really trying to say. So I'll try and say it much more casually. It's fair to say that life feels, from the general perspective, if you were to ask most people, their experience of life is that they are a physical entity, a human being, a physical entity in a world of space and objects that are form, picked up by the senses, but the senses seem to just tell us about the form. Means the tree is solid and it's made of wood, and the road is solid and it's made of concrete, and the truck next to us is solid and it's made of iron and rubber on the wheels, and there's a man in it who is got form, and I'm in my car in this lane, and then there's another car on that side in that lane, and something in front of me and something behind me. And so without this being a concept, like if we really go to our experience, and yours, but if yours is changing, imagine the experience exactly as it is as we're growing up, before we've come across any talk about life being not quite as it seems. So we go to the experience of life, and life really is an experience of form. And form creates space, or form implies space. And so it really is, and space implies time. So it is a world of objects, a world of time, a world of space. So a three-dimensional world, really. And we sort of wake up and we start moving in this three-dimensional world. We're moving towards food, and then we're moving towards work, and then during the day at work we're moving towards from one thing to the other, trying to get somewhere or getting somewhere, because in a world of form it's really about getting somewhere. And if we leave the concepts around and we go back to ourself in this world of form, we're really, if we put it simply, we're really just trying to get more beneficial form than non-beneficial form. It's our modus operandi, really, without us even being aware of it. If it's cold, we turn the heater on. If it's too hot, we open the windows. If it's dark in the room, we open the curtains. If it's too bright, we put sunglasses on. If the distance is far, we get on the bike or in the car. If we feel like fresh air, we go for a walk. And so we're really just navigating through a world of form. And we know ourselves as an object of form. So pleasure and pain, which is really how all the other forms interact with us, the inanimate forms, the tables and the rocks, and the animate forms, which are really animals and other people. So the world is essentially a mix of animate and inanimate objects. And we are, so the animate object is an object with consciousness and life. And so essentially we know ourselves as this form object moving in time, trying to improve, trying to get more, trying to make it better. Now, there's no criticism in this. It's really a description that hopefully someone says, well, yeah, actually, if I really come to my experience, that's makes sense. That's life. That's how it presents. So you go and ask a 12-year-old and a 20-year-old and a 30-year-old, and that's generally what we're doing, moving through a world of form. And so in the world of form, pleasure and pain is about as good or bad as it gets. And if we include emotional pleasure and pain, so obviously a lot of the form is the senses, and so we can call that physical or sensual pleasure and pain. So nice music, loud building noises, good food, bad food, hot weather, cold weather. And so the form is essentially pleasure and pain on a sense perception. And then there's also the emotional part of the human being that is where there's also preferences. So there's our biological, physical preferences, and then our biological, emotional preferences. We might like being with people, we might not like being with people. We might like people talking to us nicely, as opposed to talking to us abruptly. We might prefer that people are straight to the point instead of being all flowery. So different people have different preferences. We have friends that we like, and if they die, then that's going to be emotionally painful. And if a friend that we like surprises us and says, oh, I'm in the area, I'll drop in 10 minutes if you're free, then that's emotional pleasure. So this life of form is a life of form that delivers us pleasure or pain. So the emotional pleasure or pain is also delivered by how the objects in life treat us, or what they deliver to us, what they take away from us. And so if we continue to know life primarily as a world of form, My suggestion here is that the deeply ingrained doership and attachment to outcomes get shaken slowly. That's not to say that they won't change and weaken, especially as some intellectual concepts come in, because new stuff can come in an instant. It's, well, I never thought of it like that. I never saw it that way. And just having pointing out things on the world of, on the level, on the layer of form, can bring about a significant change to this doership and attachment to outcome. So we can talk about the genes and up-to-date conditioning of the form object, and point out, that object is functioning according to its design, and so it can't function differently. So this attitude of doership, that where we are always saying, you should act differently, that can be severely diminished simply by a concept coming in that hits us in a powerful way. If we combine that with a new perspective on life, where the formness, the form of life, in an instant gets seen to be formless, now that really can shake things up. And I've always been an advocate of the fact that the dissolution happens in a fairly unique and complex way. So people's seeking happens day after day, and there's no way that even the individual can tell you how the change is happening, because it's second by second in micro details. There are, when change is happening, it can be the smallest of things that we don't even realize our system is absorbing. That might be part of the change. And so we can talk about some common broad changes and how they happen. But as it happens for each individual, it's going to be unique. And the thing is that a teacher doesn't know how to do the change. The teachings understand the general information that's available, so it just keeps piling it in there. Understanding, knowing that that's how the process works, and the process will pick out, and the system will absorb the information that it needs next. So really the process is something out of our control. I say that really it would be like having a combination lock with 1 million numbers, and getting it right is not something that you or I are capable of doing, getting all the numbers right. Whereas the process goes through each of those numbers and slowly turns it till the right number, not through magic or anything, but just the system knows when it's sorted that little part of the process out. And when it's sorted it out, because it's processed information around it, it's effectively landed or is left on the right number. And then the process goes on to another number on the combination lock, and which is just an area, a topic, and we contemplate it, or life delivers a story or parable that adjusts that number, or maybe does 80% of the adjusting of that number. It's not on the right number yet. And we go on to another number, and then at some point we go back and another 10% of that number. So that number's 90% done. Then we go on to a number down there, and that gets completely sorted. And then we come back to this one, and the last 10% is done. So now that number's sorted. So now we've got this number and this number and that number and that number is done. And eventually all of the numbers get done, and the lock opens up. And we've got no idea. We go, well, it just happened. And I can't tell you exactly what went into moving the 65th number into its right position. But in order for all the numbers to get shifted, I think there needs to be a looking at life from different perspectives. One where life is seen to be non-causal, spontaneous, not time-bound, where we get to know ourselves not as the human being, but as awareness or consciousness in which the whole universe arises. And if that's the only approach, half of the numbers are not going to find themselves turned to the right number. And similarly, if we only had a description of daily living, then half of the numbers aren't going to find themselves turned to the right position. If a mixture comes in, the mixture is sort of what's needed for some of those, or not the mixture, the top-down approach is what's needed for some of the numbers, the bottom-up approach is needed for some of the other numbers, and a mixture is needed for other numbers. So I'd like to just talk for a little bit about how we can, from time to time, introduce an exercise, a way of seeing life that can open up an appreciation of life being something more mystical, different. We can just say different to how we have known it. And it's an exercise. It's strengthening a muscle that has atrophied or that hasn't been used in a way that it can be used. So some of the concepts that are talking about seeing life differently will be definitive. They will sound definitive. And if a teaching is taking the top-down approach only, they may never talk about the other side, because that can be powerful. It can be powerful to sort of even relegate the other side as ignorance, describe knowing life as form, as complete ignorance, and only knowing life as formless as understanding. And even though that to me is not the integrated perspective, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that a teaching says that is the truth, that one side is the truth, because it's doing it for good reason. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll talk about, put forward descriptions or concepts that can help an appreciation of this other dimension of life. What it also does, as well as help bring about a broader appreciation of the nature of life, it tends to bring a broader appreciation about the nature of the human being. And it can also be the dimension of life that is conducive to stillness and quietness and a slowing down. It revolves, I'm going to propose that this exercise, which is something that you can introduce into your life as a spontaneous practice, meaning not a practice that a practicer does and says, okay, now I need to do this, but hopefully find that it starts coming in while you're driving your car, while you're talking to someone, while you're sitting in the garden. And so how often it comes in a day is not up to us to decide. So it will revolve, this appreciation of life, this seeing life from this perspective revolves around the suggestion, the assertion that the world of form, doesn't exist independent of your awareness of it. That the world of form doesn't have an existence outside of your consciousness. Which really means the world isn't a world of form. What I'm saying is that the world, the universe, doesn't exist independent of your awareness of it. So in deep sleep, the universe collapses. In death, where consciousness is withdrawn from the body-mind organism, the universe that you know is no more. So this is contrary to our ingrained relationship to the world. Is our experience is that when we go into sleep, the world remains. That and it's not really our experience. It's how our experience of life actually is, what it tends to imply about what happens in the period when we have no experience of life. So the experience of waking up in the same bedroom each day and going to bed in the same bed each day in the same house that's in the same suburb, in the same state, in the same country, with shops in the same position relative to your house as they always have been, with a consistent network of roads that don't change, that tends to create the impression that there is an objective world that remains regardless of whether I'm aware of it or not. A world that we assume will be there when I die, that the roads and the other people will continue, the trees will continue. And it's that relationship to life, that assumption about life, that way of experiencing life, that is solidifying the notion, the understanding of life as a world of form, an objective world that exists objectively outside of what I am. And that's so that's our standard way that the human being grows. The human being is conditioned by life, moment after moment, by the experience it has of life. And these deeply ingrained attitudes towards life, attitudes towards the world of form get put in place. And what if these attitudes are part of the sense of self the false sense of self, the knowing ourself not truly, part of the belief in personal doership, and part of the attachment to outcomes, believing that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And what if, unless that is shaken up, we aren't going to have the deep knowing of peace? That there is going to remain a sense of uncomfortableness. Even if we understand some of the concepts, such as what I ordinarily put forward in life, like our happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and you're not the doer, I'm not the doer, because I am a complex biological instrument based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. You are a complex biological instrument based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. That what you deliver is part of the flow of life, and that is either pleasure or pain. So all of those descriptions are hugely important. They are changing some of those numbers on the combination lock, which is really a representation of our process happening. The spiritual seeking process that life is moving us through. So they are very important. And yet, I've suggested that there also needs to be another appreciation of life that dovetails in with those very important concepts and sinks them even deeper, such that they in combination with this alternate way of feeling life really starts to uproot the deeply ingrained beliefs. So just again, this assumption that we have that's been put in place by the way life feels, that the tree, the shops have an independent existence outside of my awareness of them, meaning that the universe exists even when my consciousness is not here. In deep sleep, the world continues, is our assumption. After I die, the world will continue. Now, I'm making an assertion that life is not really quite as it seems. Remember, life is often described as a paradox, which means it has seemingly contradictory but actually complementary sides. What that means is that if we describe one side of the coin, it can seem like it is a contradiction of the other side of the coin, and so our thinking might say, so which one is it? Because it can't be both. And as our thinking loosens up, as our appreciation of life loosens up, our thinking loosens up, such that what seemed like incomprehensible opposites become seen as actually beautiful complementaries that coexist and have to coexist in order for the whole to be exactly what the whole is. So the assertion here is life is not quite as it seems, and that what was put in place based on the experience that humans have had from a young age is maybe not a clear knowing of life, which means not a clear knowing of ourselves, and maybe that assumption that life is this way is the false assumption of who we are. So this hopefully gives us a taste of how deeply ingrained the false sense of self and attachment to outcome can be. Because I'm sure that some people in the world, a majority of people in the world, if it was suggested to them that the universe has no existence independent of the consciousness that is aware of it, which in simplistic terms means in deep sleep, the world collapses. All your friends collapse. All the other countries in the world are not there. time and space, the oceans, the sun, the planets, all of time and space collapses and doesn't exist. That's the assertion I'm putting forward. And there's going to be a huge number of people, hopefully a fewer percentage in the audience here, but a huge percentage of the world population that just thinks that I've eaten something strange today. That's making me say crazy things. So in the exercise, you may become interested in inquiring into the nature of this world of form that, according to Roger, on Tuesday, the 16th of June, according to Roger, on Tuesday, the 16th of June, life, the world, the universe, doesn't have an independent existence outside of consciousness. Outside of the consciousness that is aware of it right now. And so that might lead us in the course of our day to be curious, like, I want to understand this. I want to know what it means that the lamp does not have an independent existence outside of the consciousness that is aware of it. What it also implies is that lamp is not separate from the consciousness that is aware of it. That the consciousness and the lamp are interdependent. What might help us in this inquiry is to understand that the body is also an object of form and not the subject. Meaning the body is not the subject. It is consciousness that is the subject. Consciousness or awareness that is the subject, because the objects are said not to have an independent existence from the awareness or consciousness that is aware of them. Which means when the awareness ceases to be aware of them, the object ceases to exist. That means your car doesn't exist right now. This may sound strange, but believe it or not, even science, and I'm not using this as if science is some teller of absolute truth, but mystics have been talking about the nature of life as being, in part, what I'm putting forward today. Life is an illusion. Life is an appearance in consciousness. All there is consciousness. Life is unreal. You are not the body. What you are is formless awareness. So mystics have been talking about the illusory nature of life for thousands of years. What's really quite amazing is that as science technology has improved to the point where the observation of form can become more and more acute, as the capacity to observe the micro improves, as the capacity to measure the micro world improves, what the measurements start to show us is that science is forced to form similar conclusions to the conclusions that the mystics have formed thousands of years ago. Now, the mystics didn't form the conclusions through scientific observation and measurement. The instruments weren't there. And scientists are not coming to the conclusions based on an appreciation of consciousness, but rather based on reconciling mathematical formulas that have extruded themselves out of the observation of life from a scientific point of view. So it's really wonderful, actually, where two methodologies tend to bring together a description of life that matches. So when I say your car doesn't exist, because the awareness right now is not aware of the car, and the car has no independent existence from awareness, that is in line with, in quantum physics, the experiment of Schrodinger's cat, which is an experiment that puts a cat in a box. Sorry, animal lovers, it's not kind. A cat in a box with a random bait or food, and the food is either poisoned or not poisoned. And so the cat is given the food while in the box, and until the box is opened and the cat is observed, the science explanation is that the cat exists in both forms. In infinite form, both the cat exists both dead and alive. And at the time of opening the box and observing the cat, one of the infinite possibilities, or in this case, the two possibilities that the cat is either dead or alive, actualizes. Only at the moment of becoming aware of the cat. That while the cat is not awared, while there is no conscious awareness of the cat by the observer of the experiment, the cat exists in simultaneous opposite states. Now, the thing is that to a lay person, that just doesn't make any sense. Because our experience of life simply doesn't support that appreciation of life, including that dimension. So mystics have been telling us that life is like this. Quantum physics is telling us life is like this. And the average person goes through knowing life based on their own experience, which is essentially based on a limited set of senses and a limited investigation into the nature of life. And so it could be that the majority of the world population doesn't understand the nature of life, and therefore doesn't understand the nature of who they are or what they are, because science and mystics are also telling us that all of life is a singularity. That life doesn't exist as a conglomeration of separate parts, but rather exists as a whole that manifests as what appear to be separate parts and are experienced as separate parts. The fundamental nature of life is a singularity. This means that if you live in London, or if you live in England, London doesn't exist when you are not aware of it, which really means if it is not in your experience, London doesn't exist. Paris doesn't exist, Australia doesn't exist, America doesn't exist. What exists is the world in which, or the world that arises within consciousness. And so this talk is not a person on the other side of the world talking to you, but rather the talk is appearing within your consciousness. It is part of the universe as it exists in your moment. The universe may actually be in practice much smaller than you've been led to believe. This isn't meant to be a series of concepts that take us out into science fiction thinking, but rather a set of pointers to bring us right into the present moment. Because what I'm speaking about is the world of apparent form that you have known as your life, which is always only appearing as life in this moment. So, you might in this moment have a memory that implies that you once were 5 years old blowing out candles at your 5-year-old birthday party. Now, that is just a memory, which is a particular sort of object in consciousness in the present moment, a thought object that has an effect of creating the experience that we know as life, and influencing the experience in a particular way, just like the table object influences the present moment experience. If that object wasn't there, the experience would be different. It would be without the presence of that object. But because in the experience the object is there, we go, so that object has a specific effect on the moment. It adds form, it adds color. If we knock on the table, then the experience is saying, it creates the component of the sense of touch and sound. And thoughts are an object that has an immense effect on the qualitative nature of the experience. And memory is a specific type of thought object that creates a certain apparentness to the present moment. And so we have to say, I don't know if I was ever 5 years old and had a birthday. What I do know is that there is a memory that suggests I did. But if we start saying the world is not as it appears, the world of form is really a world of form that collapses each night in deep sleep, will collapse permanently when death happens. That's the suggestion in this satsang, that the world of form doesn't have independent existence. So that means that the form is not as real as it appears, which means time and space may not be as real as it appears, which means memory may be not as real as it appears. There's no doubt that the memory is here, but is it telling me the truth? What it does is it brings into effect a past. And so it reinforces the sense that life is a world of form and time and space, of here and there, of now, yesterday and tomorrow, which is how most people know life. The satsang is saying life's not really like that. Mystics have been saying life's not really like that. Quantum physics has been looking beneath the surface and saying, wow, life is not what it appears. Scientists can see the Big Bang. We have evidence of a theory of entanglement, that changing an object here can affect an object out on the other side of the universe. So if memory is maybe not as real as it seems, even if we did have a 5-year-old birthday party, that was life in that present moment. So life is always really an arising in this present moment. And so the inquiry is about the present moment. It's an inquiry about the nature of the present moment. So some of the things that can come into this inquiry. The universe doesn't exist independent of your awareness of it, meaning your car doesn't exist unless you're standing next to it or driving in it. That the object in the present moment is not separate from the awareness that is aware of it. That the object that seems to be objective and have independent existence is really therefore not an object with independent existence. It can't be an object of form, because how can form collapse and then reappear? Dreams, on the other hand, at night collapse and appear. And from within the dream, that is a world of form and time and space and history, none of which is exactly as it appears. In the dream, a whole ocean can appear. An ocean within a framework of time and space that wasn't there a moment before, and ceases to exist when the dream collapses. Ramana Maharshi's ultimate concept is there is no creation, there is no dissolution, nothing ever happened. The implication of that is saying none of this is real. Not in the way that we know it. What this exploration is it's an exploration into the quantumness of life. An exploration into the quantumness of the human being. The quantum dimension is the dimension that is eternal and infinite. And contrary to popular belief, the word eternal actually means the absence of time. And infinite means the absence of space. Consciousness is eternal and infinite. The quantum dimension of the human being is not time-bound. We tend to not know ourselves because we know life as a time-bound reality, a time-bound reality of space and form, which means we then know ourselves as an object within that time-bound reality of space and form, meaning we know ourselves as a time-bound object of form. Now, is the human being much more than that? Does the human being have a quantum dimension? A dimension outside of time and space? And our thinking is all about time and space, both the working mind and the thinking mind. So to become aware of the formless, eternal, infinite space, the formless, eternal, infinite dimension of the human being, thinking needs to cease for a while. This too might be something that hasn't happened for the human being. A relentless movement of thinking about the world of time and form is what has become habituated. And the thinking I'm talking about might be much more unconscious than we might appreciate. It might be a form of thinking that solidifies. So I really am talking about thinking as being different to the standard thinking we're aware of, but a much more unconscious form of cognition. That as soon as the appearance of the world of form arises, a whole series of presuppositions, unconscious presuppositions about the nature of life get applied, and therefore color and influence the experience of life that we have at the moment of waking up. So if a movement that starts being interested in the quantum appreciation of life, life that is not form, life that is not time-bound, where is the doorway to that? The doorway is always right here, now, in this present moment. And the moving through that doorway is about the falling away of certain faculties. Primarily this faculty of thinking that has become so habituated in its obvious form, where we have conscious thoughts about what someone did, what I need to do, about yesterday, about tomorrow, about the present moment. Those conscious thoughts can fit into the category of the working mind or the thinking mind. If it's the thinking mind, then that's the attitude to what's happening in the flow of life that is creating the uncomfortableness, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry and expectation. And if it's the working mind, it's just the functional thinking about what I need to buy at the shops in order to feed this body. And so the working mind is, by default, thinking about the form layer of life. So if we're going to walk through the door, metaphorically speaking, which might not be a great metaphor because it's really about a falling backwards. So if we're going to fall through the door backwards, it's the falling backwards of that faculty of thought. And what we might find is that an appreciation of the present moment for what it is allowing what is to exist free of any labeling, free of any conceptualizing. It is beyond the seeing of life as pleasure or pain, because the pleasure or pain is part of the form layer of life. And the form layer of life is essentially what we're falling out of, into the formless. Now, that's not to say that seeing the duality, the form where there is pleasure or pain, is wrong. It's just not applicable when we're appreciating the quantum dimension of life. As we integrate the quantum dimension, which is the formless, and the form dimension, when they come together, we very much need to appreciate that pleasure and pain exists, and simultaneously know ourselves connected to this quantum dimension where time and space and objects are not what they are on the outer dimension. So for the exploration into the quantum, can we start appreciating life for what it is? Which really means to not reduce it. That is the appreciation of what is. Not what should be or what could be. Not what we think about what is. Not categorizing what is as this or that. And we might start to get a sense that all of the suffering is the opposite of appreciating what is. As soon as the suffering is there, what is lost. And what has replaced it is the narrative, the story of the thinking mind. So to keep falling back out of the thinking mind, back to what is, this is where we find ourselves regardless of the experience, regardless of the content. As we fall back, we find I am that which is aware of what is. And what is doesn't require us to label it. What is arises simultaneous with the awareness that is aware of it, not separate from the awareness that is aware of it. In fact, made of the awareness that is aware of it. And that awareness, by default, is aware. So awareness is not something we must do, which is why what is can exist prior to any thinking about it. It is the most effortless movement in life. Which implies the capacity for complete relaxation. What I'm suggesting is the potential to melt into what is. The melting is a metaphor or a symbolism which can accurately depict how it feels as the thinking melts into the present. What is left is presence. And what is aware of the presence is not the body. The body is simply an object within the present moment, like all other objects, which turns out to be not an object of form, but an object of apparent form, that when known from the perspective of the awareness that is not separate from the whole experience of life, when it's known from that perspective, the form is seen and known intimately to be formless, to be no different than the form within a night dream that has apparent reality and in an instant can completely dissolve. Any sounds that arise are not arising outside of you. That's how it appears when we continue to have the residual self-image that what I am as the subject is the body. So for as long as we are convinced that the perceiving of the objects is happening from a separate subject, which is what happens when an object is confused as the subject, it then seems like there is a separate object or separate subject from the object observed. And so then that creates the appearance of perceiving with a perceiver. When there is perceiving with a perceiver, we have the perceiver, the perceived, and the act of perceiving. So 3, the perceiver, the perceived, and the act of perceiving. The perceiver is the subject. The perceived is the object. And the act of perceiving is what happens between the two separate the subject and the object. If it becomes apparent, because the ingrained belief, which is part of knowing life as this world of form, if the ingrained belief that the body is that which is doing the awareing or the perceiving, if that ingrained belief is challenged, and as the thinking, the labeling drops away, and a thought arises, that which is aware is not the body. The body is just an object arising within the field of awareness. What I am is the field of awareness. That seeing is not happening through the eyes. Hearing is not happening through the ears. Tasting and smelling and touching is not happening through the hands or the nose or the tongue. The whole apparent perceiver perceived is an illusion, and what is the truth is the singular experience where there is no perceiver perceived, but rather just perceiving. The perceiving is what is happening within that field of awareness. It is the nature of awareness to be perceiving. And what it perceives is not separate from itself, and hence there is no separate object perceived, but rather just all-inclusive, all-pervading perceiving, which is referred to as direct knowing, prior to thinking, where subject-object relationship is no more. It is what can be referred to, is referred to in some teachings as the end of experience. Because in those teachings, the word experience is referring to the knowing of life from the perspective of a subject that is separate from the object. And that is what is denoted as experience, knowing life as a life of form, a life of time and space. And when life becomes known in an instant as being not that, which happens when the thinking mind and the working mind are allowed to rest, because it's known that that is not the faculty through which the quantum aspect of life can be known. And it can't. We will never come in touch with this deeper dimension of the human being and of life by thinking. Only by being, by knowing that it's completely valid at times in life, at times during the day, to stop and to be one. Not the human being, I'm not talking about the body, for the body to be one, but for awareness to be one with the whole arising in this moment. And if we start getting glimpses of the quietness, then that starts to become a very powerful addition into the seeking that allows the cutting off of our involvement in how the flow of life should be. And so going back to the original thought that a seeker might have. Oh, I would love that the doership and attachment, the suffering the roots of the suffering would get dissolved even quicker. And if this appreciation has started to happen, in that moment the thought might be, stop. Stop and drop. It's what is referred to as abide in I am. Because when perceiving happens, or awareing, the end of subject-object relationship, there can be a stillness, a quietness. And what is known is the impersonal I amness of the awareness in which the whole momentary experience arises. And there is this undeniable sense that what I am, and even though the body is speaking, that is just the delivery mechanism of words that are somewhat appropriate, never going to be adequate to describe the sense in the moment, which is the sense in the moment is the formless awareness that I am, that I know myself as, undeniably, directly, not as a concept, but as being that. Which is why Nisargadatta's teacher says, I am that. The awakening is, I am not the body, I am that in which the body arises. So Nisargadatta's teaching includes a concept, a phrase that says, I used to know myself as an object walking around in the world, and then I came to know what I truly was the awareness or the consciousness in which the whole world arises. A complete shift in identity, a complete shift in what the subject knows itself as. So he's saying at first the subject was identified with an object, meaning there was the sense that the object was the subject. And the object walks around in a world. So that's the experience that we have before some sort of fancy spiritual concepts come in to change things up. The experience is I am this body walking around in a world of form that will exist when this person dissolves and dies, when the human being is no more and turns back into dust and ashes, that this world of form will rise. So I am an object walking around in the world. And then the sense of self is revealed. What I really am is that in which the whole universe arises. So this movement, if it starts to happen, starts to reveal a nature of the human being, a nature of the essence of what we are, that really is already complete, doesn't require outcomes in order to feel complete, is at peace. And it's from this connection to oneself that we really find my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. What it means is that I am essentially at peace already. I just haven't known myself as that. And happiness is in knowing yourself as this formless essence, where thinking is irrelevant, where thinking has the potential to stop because it's known that the thinking stopping is not a threat to what I am. When we know ourselves as the body, it seems like my mission in life is to move forward, to go from here to there where I can accumulate more pleasure and try and control life so that there's less pain. And that's really what we're doing. We're trying to essentially maximize the circumstance as best as is known from a body perspective, which is less pain and more pleasure. And as we connect to the formless aspect, it's like life is not at all what it seems. I am not what I thought I was. And so all of that movement is irrelevant. So meaning changes. We're seeking purpose, we're seeking meaning through outcomes when we know ourselves as form, which means when we don't know ourselves, at least when we don't know ourselves on this deeper dimension that I'm speaking about. And so outcome seems relevant. And that's why I started off saying that the final attachment to outcome may never completely dissolve unless life is appreciated as not what it seems. Because when it is, we know ourselves directly. All the concepts can go out the window then, and we go, it was nothing like what I thought. And mind you, I'm not even suggesting that there's bells and whistles and angels coming down from heaven. It's just a very grounded, quiet place or aspect of the human being where we can just be still. And this stillness can pervade into daily living. It will pervade into daily living as we ground there. And so often I have talks with people where it becomes clear that, okay, it's time to now know yourself differently and know the world differently, because unless that's shaken up, then we're still too firmly grounded in knowing ourselves as the physical aspect of the human being. So I'll round it off with saying happiness, enlightenment, liberation for the human being is available, but it's available in the form of peace of mind. What are we really looking for? We're looking for peace of mind in daily living. Now, daily living includes the world of form. Daily living includes the body. Daily living is the functioning of a human being in life. The human being, the problem, I use the word human being to refer to that which has both the form and the quantum dimension. Not separate from each other, but making up the human being. We tend to know the human being only on the physical side. So when I talk about the human being, what is heard is me talking about the body. The body is one aspect, a very important aspect of the human being. And if it's known without connection to the other aspect, we're lost. If we only know the formless aspect, we get lost into thinking we are formless awareness. We're a human being. So Nisargadatta, being a top-down teaching, is talking about what I've been talking about mainly in this satsang, pointing at the formless awareness in which the experience of life arises, an experience that is not separate from the awareness that is aware of it. And so he says, I am that. Ramesh said if he were to name the book, and most of you know Nisargadatta's main teaching is in a book called I Am That. And Ramesh said, I wouldn't call it I am that, but I am that living as this. So that demonstrates the integration, the awakening to the quantum aspect of life, and then integrating that with the form aspect of life. And knowing the human and life as being both simultaneous, being the interconnected opposites that are the two sides of the seeming paradox, and when they come together create a beautiful complementary union that is the whole of life. And we can't integrate if we haven't appreciated both aspects. And we can't integrate if we are only appreciating the new aspect. And the integration is part of the turning of the numbers in the million number combination lock, which will happen. We don't need to worry about it. So my encouragement today to anyone that feels like it's time to rest more often, to just allow seeing, not of the eyes, but of awareness to happen, to allow what is, free of the labeling of the interconnected opposites, to be, and to know ourselves as that in which the whole experience arises and falls. Oh. From this perspective, meditation happens naturally. And you might find yourself drawn during the day to just melt into the stillness that is your true nature.